Picture this. It's the 1st of May, 1960. Halfway around the world from Washington, a slender, black aircraft glides silently through the stratosphere above the Soviet Union at 70,000 feet. The pilot, Francis Gary Powers, has been flying for nearly 4 hours over some of the most sensitive military installations on Earth. He's done this before. Dozens of missions. The CIA told him the Soviets couldn't touch him up here. Their missiles couldn't reach this altitude. Their fighters couldn't climb this high. At 70,000 feet, the U-2 was untouchable. They were wrong. A Soviet SA-2 surface-to-air missile detonates near the aircraft. The U-2 breaks apart. Powers ejects, parachutes into a field near Sverdlovsk, and is immediately surrounded by Soviet citizens who have been watching the wreckage fall from the sky. In Washington, Eisenhower's administration doesn't know any of this yet. What they know is that a U-2 has gone missing over the Soviet Union. They assume Powers is dead and the aircraft destroyed. So they do what governments do when they're caught doing something embarrassing: they lie. They announce that a weather research aircraft has gone missing over Turkey. Routine flight. Nothing unusual. Nikita Khrushchev, sitting in Moscow with the wreckage of the U-2, Powers in custody, and the aircraft's spy cameras and film canisters spread across a table, smiles. He has Eisenhower exactly where he wants him. 16 days later, the Paris Summit, the most important diplomatic gathering since the end of World War II, the conference that might have ended the Cold War 15 years early, collapses in humiliation before it even begins. This is the story of how one aircraft, one missile, and one catastrophic lie derailed the best chance for peace the world had in a generation. The U-2 program. To understand why the shootdown mattered so much, you need to understand what the U-2 was and why it existed. By the mid-1950s, Eisenhower was in an impossible position. American intelligence about Soviet military capability was almost non-existent. The CIA had almost no human sources inside the Soviet Union. Radio intercepts gave fragments. Defector reports were inconsistent. Nobody really knew how many nuclear weapons the Soviets had, where they were based, or how quickly they could be delivered. This uncertainty was paralyzing. American defense planners, operating on worst-case assumptions, were pushing for massive military spending to counter a Soviet threat that might be far smaller than feared. The bomber gap, the alleged Soviet advantage in long-range bombers, was driving procurement decisions worth tens of billions of dollars. Eisenhower needed facts. Hard, photographic, irrefutable facts about what the Soviets actually had. The solution came from Lockheed's legendary Skunk Works division, led by the brilliant Kelly Johnson. He proposed an aircraft that could fly so high that Soviet defenses simply couldn't reach it. 70,000 feet, more than 13 miles above the Earth, above the ceiling of Soviet interceptors, above the range of Soviet surface-to-air missiles. An aircraft that could cross the entire Soviet Union in daylight, photograph everything beneath it, and return home with its film. The U-2 was that aircraft. Powered by a single Pratt & Whitney J57 engine, it had a wingspan of 80 feet on a fuselage barely 10 feet wide. It looked like a powered glider, which is essentially what it was. It could stay airborne for 9 hours, covering thousands of miles at cruising altitude. Its camera system was the most sophisticated aerial reconnaissance equipment ever built. From 70,000 feet, it could photograph objects 14 inches across. It could capture an entire Soviet military installation in a single pass, with resolution sharp enough to count the aircraft on the flight line. Beginning in July 1956, U-2 flights began crossing the Soviet Union. The intelligence they produced was extraordinary. The bomber gap evaporated. The Soviets had far fewer long-range bombers than feared. Soviet nuclear missile deployments, previously unknown, were mapped with precision. Entire categories of threat assessment were revised based on U-2 photography. The flights were illegal under international law. They violated Soviet sovereignty. Eisenhower knew this. He personally approved every single mission over Soviet territory, understanding the diplomatic risk if anything went wrong. The CIA assured him nothing would go wrong. The Soviets couldn't reach the U-2. They were wrong. And Eisenhower knew in his gut they might be wrong, which is why he had been increasingly reluctant to approve missions as Soviet air defense technology improved. He had approved the May 1st mission with deep misgivings. Those misgivings were entirely justified. The shootdown. The morning of May 1st, 1960, Powers takes off from Peshawar, Pakistan, in UTWO Article 350. His mission is to fly northeast across Afghanistan and then deep into Soviet territory, photographing targets including the Tyuratam missile test facility, various military installations, and finally landing at Bodo Air Base in Norway. The entire flight will cover nearly 3,000 miles of Soviet territory. Soviet radar tracks the U-2 from the moment it crosses the border. What happens next is a complex, chaotic scramble of Soviet air defense assets trying to reach an aircraft at an altitude their equipment was never designed to handle. Soviet MiG interceptors are scrambled repeatedly. They cannot reach Powers' altitude. Several pilots push their aircraft so hard trying to climb to the U-2 that they risk losing consciousness and destroying their own aircraft. None get close. Then an SA-2 surface-to-air missile battery near Sverdlovsk fires a salvo. The missiles were not aimed at the U-2 directly. They were aimed at where the U-2 would be when they arrived at altitude, a calculation that the improved SA-2 guidance system was newly capable of making. One missile detonates close enough to the aircraft to damage it severely. The U-2 enters an uncontrolled spin. Powers cannot reach the destruct switches that would destroy the aircraft and its equipment before bailing out. He ejects. He survives. The aircraft, despite expectations, survives in remarkably intact condition. The camera equipment survives. The film survives. The Soviet intelligence haul is everything they could have hoped for. Not just a downed American spy plane, but documentary proof of what it had been doing. In Moscow, Khrushchev now faces his own decision about how to handle this windfall. He has options. He can disclose everything immediately, humiliating America on the eve of the Paris summit. He can say nothing and watch Eisenhower lie his way deeper into a hole. He can use it as leverage in Paris. He chooses a masterpiece of diplomatic theater: the lie and its unraveling. In Washington, the CIA knows only that the U-2 has gone missing. They assume the worst, that the aircraft was lost at altitude, and the wreckage is unrecoverable, scattered across thousands of square miles of Soviet territory. They assume Powers is dead. Based on this assumption, NASA, which provided the civilian cover for U-2 flights, issues a press release on May 5 stating that a weather research aircraft based in Turkey has gone missing after the pilot reported oxygen difficulties. The aircraft, the statement says, may have inadvertently strayed into Soviet airspace. It is a careful lie, constructed around the assumption that the Soviets have nothing to contradict it. On May 5, Khrushchev stands before the Supreme Soviet. He announces that an American aircraft has been shot down violating Soviet sovereignty. He describes the aircraft. He provides coordinates. He expresses outrage at American provocation on the eve of a summit designed to reduce Cold War tensions. Crucially, he says nothing about Powers, nothing about the wreckage, nothing about the cameras or the film. The State Department, still assuming Powers is dead and the wreckage unidentifiable, doubles down. They issue a statement acknowledging that a NASA weather aircraft might have strayed over Soviet territory due to oxygen failure, but insisting it was not on any intelligence mission. This is the moment the trap closes. On May 7, Khrushchev returns to the podium with a smile that Soviet officials present would later describe as the most satisfied expression they had ever seen on the premier's face. He announces that Powers is alive and in Soviet custody. He announces that the wreckage is largely intact, in Soviet hands, and being examined by experts. He announces that the camera equipment has been recovered along with its film, showing Soviet military installations. He announces that Powers has confessed to being a CIA pilot on an intelligence mission. And then, methodically, he reads out the serial numbers from the aircraft's equipment, the identification numbers from Powers' fake civilian documentation. The details of the operation that make every element of the American cover story not just wrong, but demonstrably, publicly, catastrophically wrong. The Eisenhower administration had been caught in a lie, not a deniable, ambiguous, arguable lie, a flat, specific, detailed, on-the-record lie that the Soviets could disprove piece by piece with physical evidence. Eisenhower's impossible choice. What Eisenhower faces in the days between the May 7th revelation and the May 16th opening of the Paris summit is a crisis without a good solution. Every option available to him carries devastating costs. Option 1. Deny everything. Claim Powers is a rogue pilot, that the CIA acted without presidential authority, that the administration had no knowledge of the overflight. This would be the diplomatic convention. Intelligence operations go wrong. Leaders claim ignorance. The fiction of deniability is maintained. Khrushchev might even accept this framework. It would give him a face-saving way to let the summit proceed. But Eisenhower refuses. He will not throw the CIA and Powers to the wolves. He will not pretend he didn't know about a program he personally approved. He considers it a matter of personal honor. He cannot disavow something he authorized. Option 2. Admit everything and apologize. Accept Soviet sovereignty was violated. Express regret. Commit to ending the flights and try to salvage the summit. This Eisenhower also cannot bring himself to do. Admitting that American intelligence had been systematically violating Soviet airspace for 4 years would be a political catastrophe domestically. It would validate every Soviet complaint about American aggression. It would potentially expose the full extent of the U-2 program and the intelligence it had gathered. Option 3. Admit the flights happened, justify them as necessary for American security, and refuse to apologize. This is what Eisenhower chooses. On May 11th, the State Department issues an unprecedented statement acknowledging that the U-2 flights over the Soviet Union have been conducted with presidential authorization as part of an intelligence-gathering program necessitated by Soviet secrecy about its military capabilities. It is a remarkable statement. A sitting American president has admitted, on the record, to authorizing systematic violation of another country's sovereign airspace. Nothing like it had happened in the modern era of diplomacy. Khrushchev, flying to Paris for the summit, is in a bind of his own making. He had wanted the summit. He had invested enormous political capital in the policy of peaceful coexistence with the West. The hardliners in Moscow, the military, the party conservatives, had always been suspicious of détente. Now Khrushchev arrives in Paris needing to demonstrate that he hasn't been made a fool of by Eisenhower's admission. The Paris summit collapse. May 16, 1960. The Élysée Palace in Paris. The four powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France, are assembled for what was supposed to be a historic conference. Eisenhower, Khrushchev, Harold Macmillan, and Charles de Gaulle. The agenda was ambitious. Nuclear test ban treaties, Berlin's status, steps toward broader arms reduction. Potentially, a presidential visit to Moscow that would have been the first by an American president. The framework for a genuine reduction in Cold War tensions. Before the first formal session can begin, Khrushchev demands the floor. What follows is one of the most extraordinary diplomatic performances of the Cold War era. Khrushchev speaks for nearly an hour. He denounces the U-2 flights in the strongest possible terms. He demands that Eisenhower personally apologize for the overflights. He demands a commitment that such flights will never happen again. He demands that those responsible be punished. And he withdraws his invitation for Eisenhower to visit the Soviet Union. He does not quite say the summit is over, but everyone in the room understands that he has made the summit impossible. The conditions he has attached to Soviet participation, a presidential apology, a punishment of those responsible, an absolute commitment against future overflights, are conditions Eisenhower cannot meet without catastrophic domestic political consequences. Eisenhower responds with remarkable restraint. He announces that the U-2 flights have already been suspended and will not be resumed. He does not apologize. He does not offer to punish anyone. For 2 days, the other leaders, Macmillan particularly, in increasingly desperate private sessions, try to find a formula that will allow the summit to proceed. Some face-saving language, some ambiguous commitment, some way for both men to step back from the cliff edge. There is no formula. Khrushchev, having committed publicly and loudly to his demands, cannot back down without appearing weak before the Soviet military and party establishment that had always doubted his détente policy. Eisenhower, having committed publicly to neither apologizing nor accepting the premise that American intelligence activities were illegitimate, cannot move without appearing to capitulate to Soviet ultimatums. On May 17, Khrushchev announces that the Soviet Union is withdrawing from the summit. The conference is over before it began. Khrushchev flies back to Moscow. Eisenhower flies back to Washington. The best diplomatic opportunity of the Cold War's first 2 decades is dead. What was lost? The collapse of the Paris summit needs to be understood in the context of what had seemed possible in the months before May 1, 1960. The late 1950s had seen a genuine, if fragile, thaw in Cold War tensions. Khrushchev's famous secret speech denouncing Stalin in 1956 had signaled a new Soviet leadership willing to acknowledge the crimes of the past and potentially chart a different course. His visit to the United States in 1959, including the famous tour of a supermarket that genuinely seemed to impress him, had generated real optimism about the possibility of a working relationship between the superpowers. Both Eisenhower and Khrushchev understood, in ways that their respective hardliners did not, that the arms race was consuming resources that both countries desperately needed for economic development. Both men had seen war, neither wanted nuclear conflict. Both were, in their very different ways, looking for an exit from the escalating cycle of mutual threat. The Paris summit was supposed to be the framework for that exit, not a final piece. Nobody was that naive, but a beginning, a structured reduction in tensions that might, over years and decades, lead somewhere better. After Paris, that possibility evaporated for years. Khrushchev, having staked his domestic credibility on détente and been embarrassed, was vulnerable to hardliner pressure. The missile crisis of 1962, the closest the world has come to nuclear war, was in part a consequence of the political dynamic unleashed by the Paris collapse. Khrushchev needed a foreign policy victory to shore up his position, and his decision to place missiles in Cuba was a gamble made by a leader whose room for maneuver had been dramatically narrowed by what happened in May 1960. The arms race accelerated through the early 1960s. Nuclear arsenals grew, proxy conflicts multiplied. The next serious détente effort, Nixon and Kissinger's opening to China and the Soviet Union, wouldn't come until the early 1970s. A decade of heightened Cold War danger had at least some of its roots in a missile above Sverdlovsk and a lie told in Washington. The intelligence revolution, the U-2 shootdown, also had profound implications for how America gathered intelligence, implications that shaped the entire subsequent history of the Cold War. The most obvious lesson was that manned overflights of denied territory were too politically costly to continue. You could not risk another powers incident. You could not again put an American president in the position of having to admit to or deny a program that Soviet air defenses might expose at any moment. The solution was already in development: reconnaissance satellites. The Corona satellite program, which had been running parallel to the U-2 program, achieved its first successful film recovery in August 1960, just 3 months after the shootdown. By the early 1960s, satellite reconnaissance was providing coverage of Soviet territory that exceeded anything the U-2 had been able to offer, with none of the diplomatic risk. The shootdown, paradoxically, accelerated the transition to satellite reconnaissance by making continued manned overflights politically impossible. The intelligence community that emerged from the 1960s was one built around technical collection systems, satellites, signals intelligence, electronic monitoring, rather than the high-risk human-piloted penetration missions that the U-2 represented. This transformation had lasting consequences. Technical intelligence systems are extraordinarily capable at counting things: missiles, aircraft, ships, tanks. They are less capable at understanding intentions, reading leadership dynamics, assessing political will. The emphasis on technical collection over human intelligence that followed the U-2 affair contributed to intelligence failures in later decades, where the question wasn't what the adversary had, but what they intended to do with it. Final thoughts. Francis Gary Powers spent 21 months in Soviet captivity. He was tried for espionage, convicted, and sentenced to 10 years. In February 1962, he was exchanged on the Glanniki Bridge in Berlin for Rudolf Abel, a Soviet intelligence officer held by the United States. He returned to America to a reception that was, by any measure, ungrateful. Suspicion about why he hadn't used the suicide pin the CIA had provided him. Questions about why he had talked. A CIA debrief that seemed designed to find fault rather than understand what happened. He spent years defending his conduct. He wrote a book. He eventually worked as a helicopter traffic reporter in Los Angeles. He died in a helicopter crash in 1977. He was 47 years old. Eisenhower served out his term, leaving office in January 1961, with his famous warning about the military-industrial complex, a warning that had particular resonance coming from a man who had watched military and intelligence imperatives override diplomatic judgment in May 1960. Khrushchev was removed from power in October 1964, in part because of accumulated foreign policy setbacks, of which Paris was one of the first and most damaging. The U-2 itself continued flying, primarily along the periphery of the Soviet Union rather than over it, and in other parts of the world where the political calculus was different. U-2s flew over Cuba during the missile crisis, providing the photographic evidence that confirmed Soviet missile deployments. They fly today, redesignated the TR-1, still gathering intelligence from the edge of space. The Paris summit is a case study in how intelligence operations and diplomacy can collide with catastrophic results. Eisenhower approved the May 1 mission over his own misgivings because the CIA and military intelligence community were pressing for maximum collection before the summit created political constraints on overflight operations. The irony is exquisite and painful. The mission flown to gather intelligence before diplomacy constrained it ended up destroying the diplomacy entirely. The lesson is one that intelligence communities and political leaders have struggled with ever since. Intelligence gathering and diplomatic engagement are not always compatible. Sometimes, the collection imperative, the drive to know everything possible about the adversary, creates risks that outweigh the intelligence value of what's collected. On May 1, 1960, the risks outweighed the value catastrophically. A missile fired above Sverdlovsk didn't just bring down an aircraft, it brought down a summit, delayed détente by a decade, and reminded the world that in the Cold War, the distance between careful diplomacy and total disaster was measured in the time it took a surface-to-air missile to reach 70,000 feet. Until next time, the most dangerous moment in any negotiation is the one just before it begins, because that's when the smallest things can destroy the largest possibilities.